It's great to be back with the family and friends, the same faces, and to be here on the 50th. I received an email this week and said, it's so great you're going to be at the 50th. Remember when you were there as the guest speaker on the 30th? And yes, I was around on the 50th, but not at the meetings. I think I was still growing up somewhere in Saskatchewan. But I want to congratulate the World Congress, Ukrainian World Congress. 50 years seems like a long time, but it's not really. It's a very short time when you do things like foreign policy, work on human rights issues. Everything is incremental. So I think what we heard, the comments before, we start at one point, and as long as we move forward, and this is really always my message, that we can adapt and change, because those that we serve adapt and change, and from generation to generation. 50 years ago, I've been preoccupied with the Tax Act in Canada, and I'm hearing all kinds of points of view of what we should or shouldn't do. And I said, well, the last tax reform that we had, people were using landlines and party lines. We didn't even know what a cell phone was. And that was some 50 to 60 years ago. So congratulations for going through all of the changes and being relevant today, maybe even more so today than you were 50 years ago. It's really a true celebration about the persistence of Ukrainians around the world. And I want to look back, because you asked me to do the Canadian portion, the way forward in Canada. I want to look back just very, very briefly, because it's very important when I work in foreign policy that I know where we're coming from if I'm going to be relevant for the future. And it's amazing how many people today don't know the past. I think even more so. The world is moving so fast that young people can barely catch up with what's going on now and sort out what's truth, what's fact, what's fiction. We know all that. So a little bit for those who aren't Canadian, and maybe some of us Canadians, we always talk about the first Ukrainians coming in 1898. Well, they were a certain type, and what were they looking for? A better life? Or they came to Canada out of necessity. And either way, they spent the first decades, and others kept coming. We know about the first wave, the second wave, the third, the fourth, and fifth, and maybe even the sixth now. They came, and their focus was to have a better life for their children. They didn't necessarily have a better life in many ways. They had more security, they had more options. But they came to be Canadian. That was the issue. So many immigrants, and as I travel around, when you leave your homeland and move elsewhere, your first task is to be part of the community, the country that you've arrived at. And I can go to Brazil, and I can go to, we were just talking about Burundi. Immigrants come to those countries too. But they don't have quite the capability in their countries to become part of the community, partly because each country is so different, but also they've gone to countries that they find out later are not as free and democratic as Canada is, despite our faults. So I think Canadians spent decades trying to become Canadian. And one of the single moments in Canadian history that I remember is when we were no longer hyphenated Canadians. We were always saying, I'm a Ukrainian Canadian, I'm a Scots Canadian, etc. And finally, we became Canadian. And of course, the Multicultural Act helped very much. And so I think of the Prime Minister, Diefenbaker, who felt he was a hyphenated Canadian, said he was not going to be a hyphenated Canadian. And Senator Yusik is certainly prominent in the multiculturalism. But for every person that is identified with an act, think about the hundreds of Ukrainians that were behind that in our communities, because we organize if we see a cause, if we see a fault. So when I think about becoming a Canadian rather than a hyphenated Canadian, or when I think of being proud of being a Ukrainian and bringing that heritage into the mosaic of Canada, I think of the hundreds of Canadians who were of Ukrainian descent or actual immigrants to Canada. They formed the policies and the practices. So what I like about the Ukrainian community is it's sometimes the community that gets it done without taking the credit. And that's made Canada better, and that's what makes me very proud of my heritage. Now, we know that it wasn't easy becoming a Canadian. We know about the internment. We know about the difficulties. We know about the fights and the fight in the good sense. No physical combat in that intended. It's the trying to get Canadians recognized. And so we're very proud of Canadians that have been able to move on. And it's interesting now that Ukrainian Canadians come before us often with great credibility in Canada who don't identify themselves as Canadians right away. They simply are proud to be whatever they are in Canada. So I think it underscores to me over and over again that it is very important that we understand where we come from. And I found it when I went overseas that Ukrainians born in Canada or who've come to Canada, when they're on the international front, they always with pride talk about their responsibility to Canada first before they go on to the other international causes. And of course the one that they're usually very, very compassionate about and passionate both, is of course of Ukraine. We spent decades in Canada fighting the propaganda of the Soviet Union, communism, and the Iron Curtain. So when Ukrainian independence came, my message in all of the other comments that were made to people of the joy and thank God after all these years Ukraine is independent, I said, yes, I celebrate with you, but now the hard work begins. And we know now that the recent history of Ukraine has been difficult. It hasn't been a smooth transition to democracy. Little did I know that my message at that time would be as prophetic. I was talking about the reformation of Ukraine, which is still one of the issues we have to continue to deal with in Ukraine. But did I believe that Russia would enter onto the soil of Ukraine and that we would be today talking about the sovereignty and the integrity, territorial integrity of Ukraine? So the diaspora's role has changed from one which was simple, let's get independence to Ukraine, to now a very shifting world of the rules that we spent 50 years, most of us fighting on the human rights flank, to get those international treaties on human rights, on territorial integrity. It's only 200 years ago that we recognized territorial integrity. It's disconcerting to know that all of those systems that we spent building up to bring an international order are now in jeopardy. And of course it has been the actions in Ukraine by Russia and those who support that stance. But what I do in foreign policy is note that there is a questioning of those international orders. We see that some are not as committed. We cannot get votes on human rights issues through the UN because there are many countries who simply do not want the order that we have created. So where do we find our friends? Well, we find them in NATO, because NATO is a defensive alliance. NATO came together after the Second World War, and it's ironic because Remembrance Day is upon us tomorrow. We came together and said never again, and all for one and one for all. So we built an alliance of protection, defensive alliance, not an aggressive alliance, a defensive alliance, and all for one and one for all. We also put in an article in the Article 2 that we have to take some preventative steps, that we need to negotiate, that we need to protect our independence. And so we have probably used Article 2 more often than most people know. But we do know that we used Article 5, a threat to one is a threat to all, only once in the history of NATO. And that, of course, was at 9/11 in the United States. And a lot of people don't know that, but that's the only time we exercised any need to be in an Article 5 mode. What is important about NATO to me, and why I'm so involved in it, is I can't count tanks and guns and stuff like that. That's not me. But I know the worth of our military, and I know the need internationally to defend one's country and to defend like-minded. NATO is built on values. You have to share the same value system as the countries that are in NATO. But what we have said in NATO is it's an open-door policy. Anyone who shares our beliefs is welcome to come into the European strategy, which is not just a European strategy, and I'll talk about that in a minute. It's a Euro-Atlantic strategy. And I want to talk about Canada and the U.S. a little later. So, of course, we have to have interoperability. You have to be politically ready. You have to be militarily ready to join NATO. And those are steps. But the most important thing is that you share the values, and those are of freedom, of the international orders that we have subscribed to. Now, what's interesting to me, that we didn't talk too much about NATO. And in fact, about the time that countries were gaining independence in and around Europe and elsewhere, there was talk about, do we need NATO? And so there was no need for a NATO. But 20 years, 25 years later, we're finding that we need it more than we've ever needed it. And the reason is that we need to protect our basic security and our value system. Now, some people say to me, well, where does Europe start and where does Europe end? Well, I don't think that's the debate. To me, it is, where do the countries in the center of Europe belong? And where is the center? Well, it certainly isn't on the Pacific, on the Atlantic Ocean, and it's certainly not somewhere over into the Pacific, but it is somewhere. And where I think I come down is Ukraine is right at the heart of where we need to talk about European values and European-centric looking. That doesn't mean that you don't have another flank and another direction you go, whether it's south, north, or east. But if we do not protect Ukraine with its aspirations to move west as well as in other directions, because we have more than one foreign policy, depending on which direction we're going. But in the center of it is, if Ukraine shares our values, and we believe it is and is moving in the right direction, it has to have space to make its own determination what it does for its own security and defense. And so if Ukraine cannot make its own choices, if its borders can be penetrated and we look the other way, we are even more vulnerable than they are. Because as Ukraine goes, so goes much of Europe. We are then exposed, and the Baltics know this in spades. So I don't want to preach to the converted. You know more about NATO, I think, some of you, than I do. But I assure people that it was very hard in Canada to explain why Canada is involved in NATO at the time of the early 90s when I went into the Senate. And, of course, we understand our need to cooperate with the United States, but why Europe? And it came down to the value system and capability. Will we move together? And can we defend ourselves singularly, or do we need alliances? And obviously the answer is even the United States needs alliances. And therefore, we may be in NORAD, but we also need NATO if we want security for our borders. And if we want to build a world that values what we stand for. I've gone on to it. When are you going to cut me off?
It's okay.
I'm still on Winnipeg time, so it's only 4:30.
Right into the bank.
Now, I want to, excuse me, my voice is going too much talking. Thank you. It's just to take my breath. Canada can't stand alone, so we had to find our neighbors and friends. The issue that I find was interesting for Canadians going into NATO, and NATO Parliament is what I'm really talking, Parliamentary Assembly, is are we equal to, are we consistent with Europe, and why should we be so concerned about Europe, the European Union? Because so many of the resolutions that hit the floor would talk about that we need some commonality, complementarity with Europe. And I must say, I was one of those that never focused in on that until I started to see that the world is very complex. And it is good to be unique, but you've got to find the common threads. And Europe is very much moving in the direction that we are moving in, struggling with the same things we are. We're back to the same values. And so I found that a strong Europe is a strong Canada. And I think Europeans who work in foreign policy understand a strong Canada. And particularly when I'm talking about working on the issues of democracy, rule of law, and supporting international systems. So I don't want to preach at you any further on that. But I want to stand back and say that the community has been one of the best tools to transmit understanding about being a Canadian and why it's important to care about another country. And so I see that sometimes global affairs, as it's now called, doesn't take into account the diaspora. They're too much into international relations. But the diaspora in Canada has done a very good job of, first of all, saying we're Canadian, and therefore it's important that our voice be heard on issues of international relations. And so it's not necessarily an issue of being a diaspora. It's an issue of being a Canadian and where we want to emphasize and maintain some credibility on foreign policy. There are two things that I want to, two lessons that I've learned about the diaspora's growth and development in Canada. At first, I remember when independence came to Ukraine, many of us were very preoccupied with putting Ukraine forward and getting it to move. And there was this, well, why don't they do it our way? You know, where this is good for a democracy, do it this way. And, you know, this is my country. And I know my lesson was to keep saying to them, it's your country of origin, it's your country of heritage. but Ukraine is independent. So there was a learning curve in Canada for the diaspora, all of us, to learn how to deal with our own foreign affairs department and our own government. And we became very sophisticated, and I think leaders, sometimes other diaspora come to me in Canada and say, how come you're so successful? And I said, because we learned that we weren't speaking for the diaspora. We were speaking for a knowledgeable diaspora for what was good for Canada. And we made that translation, and I think it has been very good. And I led 4 election missions, I guess, to Ukraine. The first one was very centered on Ukrainians in the mission. The next one, I demanded that there be Canadians from everywhere in Canada and that there be a mix of all kinds of Canadians. And that was one of the most successful missions as an example to Ukraine of how Canada operates, that every Canadian cares about what's going on in Ukraine. And I think that was one of the most significant lessons that we taught our government and I think taught ourselves. The next, I think, is that we've taken for granted that the international system is going to stay where it is. Well, what I've learned from NATO and on my work in the Senate is all of these international orders that we put in place are very fragile right now because there are people who are no longer building towards a consensus to enter those treaties. They want to change them. They want to build a different order. And so I see a shifting in the international order that we put 50 years into. We now have to rethink how we maintain that order. One of the examples I use, because it's so current and I'm kind of proud of it, is the Magnitsky Bill. I've worked on trying to get human rights defenders protected, and I started that in the mid-'80s when I was the Canadian ambassador for human rights in Geneva. Put forward the first resolution, it failed. Nobody had an appetite because I could see the human rights defenders, those that speak up, and it was because I knew the price that so many Ukrainians had paid for speaking up for human rights. And I knew how countries were marginalized who spoke up for those. And I knew the East-West battle that went on. So I was very particular to say, if we're going to maintain our orders, and that we need people with not our country, but elsewhere to speak up for these. So I've spent about 25 years working on behalf of human rights defenders and activists. At the same time, of course, the Magnitsky issue came along. And Mr. Magnitsky, who was not a human rights activist or defender, he cared about his country, Russia. And so he was hired as a lawyer, and he paid with his life. So I'm sure most of you have read about Mr. Zaryckyj Magnitsky. So people approached me to join a coalition so that we could put in a Magnitsky bill that would target individuals who were the cause of Mr. Magnitsky's death. These are the violators and the corrupt people. Individuals, not state to state, but individually. And I said, yes, I'll support you, but I'm not going to be very active. Because I believe every human rights activist anywhere is important. And we will not be credible if I stand up as a Canadian of Ukrainian only talking about Russia. We need to care as much about any other activist who dies somewhere else. And so I was very pleased that a coalition of parliamentarians joined me, and I was able to introduce a bill that is a global Magnitsky bill. It can be used for any violator anywhere. And the other part of that bill that was so important to me is I've been fighting for international orders that protect human rights, encourage democracy, rule of law. We had a gap in our system which was created by the changing world. We go out and we argue for human rights around the world. But we have this gap in our law in Canada. We're proud of our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We're proud of many of the things that we've done. But those corrupt officials in another country have been using our bank accounts, have been using our schools, have been buying our properties in Canada. And Mr. Karamurza put it best. When it was the Soviet Union, and Mr. Karamurza is the second in command to Mr. Nemtsov, who also lost his life in Russia fighting for rule of law. Mr. Karamurza was, by the way, poisoned twice, but continues to go back and continues to fight. So I'm rather partial to quoting him because he's still an activist, even though he's suffered much more than I've ever had to. I've been targeted, but in a different way. He said in the Soviet Union, you could not talk about money that floated to us. It was basically in the Soviet Union. But today with mobility, these people commit these acts in another country against human rights defenders. But the money flows come to us. There's children want to be educated in our schools, and met us, meaning Europe, Canada, United States, and elsewhere, by the way. They want to come here. They want our system. But they've made it possible for them to utilize our systems because of corruption and human rights violations in their own countries. And so he said, we've become enablers. And if we are enablers, is the difference between a regime that allows it to happen on their soil so much different from us allowing them to be, get the proceeds here. So the Magnitsky Bill covers that gap in human rights that we had in Canada. So from this point on, it is beware. Beware in your own country because of the international order, but beware that you not think you can come to Canada because you will be found out. And we're not going to be cavalier about just naming people and suspicions. We're going to do what a rule of law country does. We're going to prove case by case by case. Because we have people like you sitting in this room who are traveling the world, who do know what goes on and can give us information. I am now getting information from people in Canada about a lot of countries. And if you'll notice the minister, and I thank her for it, Minister Freeland, for moving quickly on the bill once it got through. It took 2 years to get it, but we've sanctioned Russians, we've sanctioned Venezuelans, and South Sudan, all countries I have worked in. And so we are not selective with our justice. We're even-handed, and we have proof. I've gone on longer about that than I intended to. What I want to say more to the diaspora, as you've called yourselves here all the time, is I work in a lot of the newer countries, and Ukrainians come up to me all the time there. We're fortunate in Canada. We have a critical mass of Ukrainians, and we've learned how to use that, and I think we've learned how to use it very, very strategically. Even in the United States, and I rarely want the United States off the hook. Someone said, you go to Chicago, there's a competition there. There are other communities almost as large as the Ukrainian community in Canada. So I want to pay tribute to Canada that we have strategically used our critical mass in a very, very unique, and I might say clever way. And what I think the next decade should be is about reaching out to the diaspora wherever they are. Because many of the diaspora in countries that I visit, and that's Africa, South America, are still struggling to become part of the country they're in while they're seeing what's happening in Ukraine. And for them to be able to speak out, they need our help. So the more organized, our job is to continue that process in the United States and in Canada and around the world. I've recently been in Argentina and Brazil, so it's amazing. I know, Curitiba, you've been there, but you know there are Ukrainians now in São Paulo. Yes, we know that. But they're going into other places very, very quickly. And we need to reinvent how the World Congress works. And I think we do it because we've got to recognize that we now have so much experience. Let's share it so they can adapt it and change it to theirs. And then we'll have a World Congress where the Canadians will be over there, will be overwhelmed with all the other countries. The other thing I wanted to say about the progress we've made in 50 years is we're changing. We're in a very, very precarious world. And it's not just North Korea I'm talking about, and it's not just what's going on in some of our countries. We're all under a whole new phase of intellectual properties that have never been utilized in the way we are. I grew up with, I was saying, on a farm my first 5 years where we had party lines and telephones. I can't even name the gadgets people are using for positive and negative. So we are being bombarded within our own countries, and it is destabilizing some of the common understandings we had. And our party systems and our political systems are under those pressures. I said it 20 years ago, and I sound like an old lady who's being prophetic. I am, on both counts. The thing is that we thought that we had a stable and secure system, but democracy moves. It's an ideal. The people today in our societies are looking for different things than I was looking for. They have different levers. They have different expectations. And we have to turn back and look at the younger generation of Canadians of Ukrainian descent and Americans and say, what do you need to continue to contribute to your own country and to Ukraine in different ways than we do? I speak to a lot of service clubs in Canada. What's their biggest complaint? No new members. They're all retiring. I think our World Congress and our Canadian Congress could be in that light. We're doing things with youth. We have to listen to the youth, but we shouldn't be delivering it to them. They should be telling us what they need. And so I think that's a strong message. We can't take our alliances, whether they are NATO or our support for Europe, as we did before, because Europe is changing, Canada's changing, the United States is changing, and the world is changing. So my plea to you is, look at your history. You did what you had to when you had to. And I think what we have to think about is, what do we need today to bring Ukraine into a free and democratic world fully? And what do we have to do to ensure that Ukraine regains its territorial integrity and sovereignty? And we have to mobilize the next generations. It is not going to be an easy task. We're going to need allies. We're going to have to change our modality of work. And we need to, above all, take advice of every individual. If you look at the history of the World Congress, it's always been one person in the right spot at the right time that was able to mobilize all the rest of us who are looking in different directions to bring us together. So I see us as the critical mass that can change the world for the better, as I see some of it unraveling in the wrong direction. But being part of you makes me hopeful. And when I see Ukrainians in Ukraine, the young generation, and I see Canadians, the younger generation, sometimes I can't talk to them because they talk in these words, techie words I don't understand. But I know that they care about their country. I know they care about the world order, and they will be, I think, as successful as we've been. So I may have sounded a bit cynical, but I'm a cynical optimist. And I'm eternally grateful for being part of the diaspora. Thank you.
Well, I'll return the compliment to the Senator.